She once looked me straight in the eye and said, "I deserve better treatment." In that moment, I realized she was right, but not in the way she thought. The best treatment I could ever give her was to walk away and leave her with the silence she had earned. That's how our story began to unravel, a journey I never expected to take. One that started with love, turned into disappointment, and ended in the kind of clarity you only get when you finally let go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Adrian, and I had always considered myself a patient man, someone who believed in giving chances, in putting others before myself. I grew up in a small coastal town, where kindness wasn't just a virtue, it was a way of survival. My parents raised me to think about others, to treat people with respect, and to always give the benefit of the doubt. It was this mindset that guided much of my adult life, especially when I moved to the city in search of opportunities. That's where I met her, Elena. She was the kind of woman who could command a room just by walking into it, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she had this quiet confidence, this sense of being completely aware of her worth. I admired that at first. I thought I had finally found someone who would understand me, someone who would balance my quiet patience with her fierce determination. When we first crossed paths at a community event, an art exhibit of all things, I wasn't looking for anything serious. I had just settled into a new job at a marketing firm, still adjusting to city life, and the last thing on my mind was a relationship. But Elena had a way of pulling me in without even trying. She laughed easily, asked questions that felt thoughtful rather than shallow, and had this spark in her eyes that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of you. By the end of the night, she had my number, and I had the strange sensation that something important had just started, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The early days of our connection felt effortless. We'd spend hours talking in cozy cafes, walking along crowded streets as if the chaos around us didn't matter, or sitting in the park sharing stories about our childhoods. I told her about the salty air of my hometown and how I used to help my father mend fishing nets. She told me about her dream of opening her own design studio someday, a place where she could create without compromise. There was an energy between us that was undeniable, and I felt myself becoming more invested with each passing day. I thought I had finally stumbled into the kind of relationship that grows strong roots before you even notice. At that stage, there were no warning signs, no reasons for doubt. Elena would smile at me across the table, her eyes full of excitement, and I believed every word she said about partnership, about loyalty, about wanting to build something meaningful. I found myself rearranging my life to fit her in, making time after long hours at work, sacrificing weekends I might have spent on rest just to be with her. And honestly, I didn't mind. Love has a way of making sacrifices feel like investments, and I convinced myself that this was the kind of bond worth pouring myself into. But looking back, I realized that even in those first few weeks, there were subtle patterns forming. Elena wasn't unkind, but there were moments when she expected the world to bend to her pace. If I was late because of work, she'd sigh in frustration, even though I had explained how demanding my deadlines could be. If I didn't respond to a text within an hour, she'd question whether I was truly invested. At the time, I brushed it off as quirks of someone who was simply passionate, someone who knew what she wanted. After all, wasn't it better to have a partner who cared enough to express disappointment than one who was indifferent? That's what I told myself. Still, I couldn't deny the small twinges I felt. I remember one evening in particular. We had gone out for dinner at a modest Italian restaurant, the kind with dim lighting and checkered tablecloths. I was excited to share some news. I had just been promoted at work, something I had been striving toward for months. I thought Elena would celebrate with me, that she'd smile, and maybe even toast with her glass of wine. Instead, she barely looked up from her phone and said, "That's nice. But honestly, Adrian, when are you going to think bigger? You deserve more than just another step in a ladder that keeps you tied to a company." It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. Flat, dismissive, as if my accomplishment wasn't worth her attention. I laughed it off at the table, but that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I wondered why it hurt so much. That's how it all began, this subtle imbalance, this tug-of-war between her expectations and my efforts. I wanted to make her happy, to show her that I could be the man she deserved, but slowly, I started to question if she would ever see what I was already giving. And yet, Even with these doubts creeping in, I stayed. Because in those early days, love still overshadowed the red flags. And hope has a way of silencing reason when you're not ready to face the truth. Back then, my life revolved around a simple routine. I woke early, sometimes before the sun even had a chance to paint the city skyline, brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, and walked to the office with my headphones in. Music was my way of insulating myself from the constant noise of traffic, street vendors, and hurried footsteps. My apartment was small, but it was mine. A place where I could return to silence after long days filled with client presentations, emails, and endless phone calls. It wasn't glamorous, but I was proud of what I had built for myself since leaving the comfort of my hometown. That life represented stability to me, something I had worked hard for. And into this carefully maintained rhythm walked Elena, with her whirlwind energy and unfiltered opinions, sweeping me into something I wasn't entirely prepared for, but couldn't resist either. At the start, being with her felt like adding color to the monotone shades of my life. She would invite me to rooftop gatherings I never would have attended on my own, introducing me to her circle of friends who were loud, confident, and sometimes intimidating. I remember the first time I went with her to one of these parties. Everyone there seemed so sure of themselves. Designers, photographers, entrepreneurs, people who lived on creativity and ambition. Elena thrived in that environment, moving effortlessly from group to group, her laughter ringing out like music. I stood by her side, both proud and slightly overwhelmed, wondering how she seemed to belong everywhere, while I struggled to find my footing. And yet, when she leaned back toward me with a smile and slipped her hand into mine, I felt like the luckiest man in the room. Our differences were obvious, but I convinced myself they were complementary. Where I was steady, she was adventurous. Where I was cautious, she was bold. She would push me to try new things, whether it was ordering food I couldn't pronounce at a foreign restaurant, or attempting salsa dancing despite my 2 left feet. I enjoyed the challenge of stepping outside my comfort zone, and Elena seemed to revel in being the catalyst for my growth. I told myself that this was what a good relationship looked like, 2 people pushing each other to be better. But beneath the surface, I began to notice a quiet tension. Elena had a way of making her expectations known without directly stating them. If she wanted something, she would drop hints until I picked up on them, and if I didn't act fast enough, there was this subtle disapproval in her eyes. For instance, when she mentioned a new cafe opening downtown, I thought she was simply making conversation. A week later, she asked why I hadn't taken her there yet, as if I should have known she wanted me to surprise her with it. These weren't arguments, not yet, but they were small reminders that I was falling short of the invisible standard she carried. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite that, I still invested more of myself into her world. I introduced her to my colleagues at work gatherings, took her back to my hometown one weekend so she could see where I came from. Even let her pick out some new art for my apartment because she insisted the bare walls reflected a lack of imagination. My friends, who had known me for years, raised their eyebrows when they saw how quickly I adapted to her preferences. One of them, Mark, pulled me aside after dinner one night and asked, "Are you sure this is you, man? I've never seen you change so much for someone before." I brushed him off with a laugh, insisting that it was normal to adjust when you cared about someone. But his words stayed with me, tucked in the back of my mind like a seed waiting to sprout. Elena, on the other hand, had a very different way of looking at things. She told me once that relationships were about constant growth, about challenging one another to never settle. I agreed in theory, but I couldn't shake the feeling that in her version of growth, I was always the one being reshaped, while she remained untouched, steadfast in her demands. Still, I swallowed that unease because I didn't want to risk losing her. I told myself that maybe she just needed more time to appreciate what I was already bringing to the table. There was one evening that crystallized this imbalance for me, though at the time I didn't fully acknowledge it. We had gone out to celebrate her friend's birthday at an upscale lounge. Everyone was dressed impeccably, and the conversations revolved around ambitious projects and lofty goals. When someone asked what I did, I answered honestly about my role at the marketing firm, but before I could elaborate, Elena cut in with, "Yes, but Adrian could do so much more. He's just scratching the surface of his potential." Everyone chuckled politely, and I forced a smile, but inside I felt reduced, as though my efforts weren't enough even in front of strangers. She didn't mean it cruelly. I know she thought she was complimenting me by implying I was capable of bigger things, but it stung nonetheless. After the party, as we walked back to her apartment, I wanted to bring it up, to tell her how small it made me feel. But she was in such a good mood, humming a tune and swinging my hand playfully, that I bit my tongue. I told myself it wasn't worth ruining the night. That was a recurring theme in those days, me choosing silence over confrontation, peace over honesty. And so my world continued to merge into hers. I spent less time on my hobbies, stopped meeting up with old friends as often, and redirected more of my energy into making sure Elena felt valued. I thought that if I just gave a little more, if I just showed her how deeply I cared, she would finally stop searching for the things she thought were missing. What I didn't realize then was that no amount of giving would ever be enough for someone who always believed she deserved better than what she already had. When I look back now, I realize that the beginning of it all was painted in colors so bright that they blinded me from seeing any shadows. Everything between Elena and me seemed effortless at first, as though the universe had placed us on a collision course, and all I had to do was follow along. It all began one late autumn evening at the art exhibit where we first met, and though I hadn't been particularly excited to attend, something about the way she carried herself pulled me in. She wasn't just another guest mingling with strangers. She was alive in that room, speaking with the kind of energy that made people lean closer, laugh a little louder, and linger a little longer. I had gone because a coworker insisted I needed to get out more, but Elena made me feel like maybe fate had agreed. After that night, our conversation seemed to stretch endlessly, as though there wasn't enough time to cover all the things we wanted to share. She told me about her childhood in a bustling household with 3 siblings, where competition and ambition were daily necessities. She laughed about how her parents expected excellence in everything from academics to piano recitals, and how that pressure had molded her into someone who never wanted to settle for less. I, in turn, told her about the quiet, slower pace of my own upbringing. The long afternoons by the water, the evenings spent helping my mother in the garden, the lessons in patience and diligence my father taught me without ever raising his voice. Elena would tilt her head and smile, saying how refreshing it was to hear about a life that sounded so calm compared to her own. At the time, I thought it meant she appreciated the contrast. Our first official date was nothing extravagant. I took her to a small family-run cafe tucked into the corner of a street most people overlooked. It wasn't flashy, but I knew the owners, and they served the best homemade pastries I had ever tasted. Elena walked in wearing a soft blue dress that brushed just above her knees, and the entire room seemed to pause for a moment. We sat in the corner by the window, and she teased me for picking such a quaint place. But by the time we were splitting the last slice of apple pie, she admitted it was charming in a way she didn't expect. She told me that she liked being surprised, and I stored that information away like a secret key I could use later. In those early weeks, Elena and I lived in a bubble that seemed impenetrable. We discovered shared interests. Movies neither of us could resist rewatching, favorite authors whose books we traded, late-night walks where we ended up laughing so hard we had to stop to catch our breath. I began to believe that what we had was special, that it was rare to find someone who could both challenge and comfort you. She spoke often of her dreams, her plans for the future, and I found myself wanting to be part of them. I imagined standing by her side when she opened her design studio, supporting her through long nights of sketching and planning, and celebrating her successes as though they were my own. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound possible. One night as we sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, gazing at the city lights below, she said, "Adrian, I don't want an ordinary life. I don't want routine or safe choices. I want something bigger, something worth remembering." Her eyes shone with conviction, and I felt a surge of admiration for her boldness. I thought I could be the anchor to her wings, the steady ground she could always return to when her flights took her too far. What I didn't understand then was that in her pursuit of the extraordinary, the ordinary comforts I offered would eventually feel like a burden to her. At the time, though, it felt like magic. She called me thoughtful, reliable, and said she had never met someone who listened as intently as I did. I basked in her compliments, letting them fill parts of me that I hadn't realized were starved for affirmation. For once, I wasn't just another face in the crowd. I was the person Elena chose to lean on, the one she invited into her world of dreams and ambitions. That kind of validation is intoxicating, and I drank deeply without questioning if it was sustainable. The beginning was also filled with small gestures that seemed insignificant then but would later feel weighty. She would text me in the middle of her busy day just to say she missed my voice. She would reach across the table and squeeze my hand whenever she felt I was lost in thought. She even showed up at my office one afternoon with takeout, insisting that I needed to eat something other than vending machine snacks when working late. These gestures made me believe she cared deeply, that her love language was as expressive as her personality. Yet even in those early moments there were subtle hints of imbalance. I recall the first time I invited her to meet my parents. They welcomed her warmly, offering stories, home-cooked meals, and the kind of hospitality that had always defined them. Elena smiled politely, but afterward she told me that while it was nice, she couldn't imagine living that kind of life. Quiet, predictable, rooted in simplicity. I laughed it off, telling myself she simply meant she thrived in the energy of the city. I didn't realize it was also her way of setting the stage for what she expected from me, to keep reaching higher, to never be content with what I already had. But for all those overlooked hints, the beginning was a time of light. I felt seen, chosen, and valued in ways I hadn't before. I believed we were building something solid, something that could withstand differences in personality and background. When I look back now, I understand that beginnings often shimmer because we project so much hope onto them, painting over cracks that will later widen into chasms. At the time, though, I didn't see cracks. I only saw Elena, radiant and full of promise, and I was certain she was the person I wanted by my side. Those first months with Elena felt like stepping into a world I had only ever imagined but never lived. There was a lightness to our days, an energy that seemed to carry us through every moment. I remember waking up each morning with a sense of anticipation, knowing that even if work was demanding or the city felt overwhelming, there was always something to look forward to with her. Our weekends became adventures. Elena loved planning outings, and though she teased me for being the more reserved one, I found myself eagerly waiting to see what she had in store. Sometimes it was as simple as a walk through a new neighborhood, ducking into shops and cafes we had never noticed before. Other times it was grander, last-minute trips to nearby towns, spontaneous picnics at the edge of a lake, or late-night drives with no destination in mind, just the two of us and the hum of the car beneath the stars. The memories that stand out the most are the little ones, though. Like the evenings we spent cooking together in her kitchen, music playing softly in the background while we argued playfully over who had the better chopping technique. Or the mornings when she would drag me out of bed far earlier than I would have liked, insisting we catch the sunrise from the rooftop, bundled in blankets with coffee mugs warming our hands. Those were the moments that stitched themselves into my heart, convincing me that this was what real happiness felt like. I began to understand why people said love could make the world feel brighter, why songs and poems had been written about it for centuries. We laughed often, too. Elena had this way of making even mundane tasks entertaining. Grocery shopping turned into an adventure, with her daring me to try obscure ingredients or challenging me to find the strangest product on the shelf. Long bus rides became opportunities to invent elaborate stories about strangers around us, whispering theories into each other's ears until we were both trying and failing to contain our laughter. Life felt full, like every day held the promise of something new. There was one night in particular that I still think of as the peak of our joy. Elena had found a small live music bar tucked away in an alley, the kind of place most people would walk past without noticing. The lighting was dim, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and spilled drinks, but the music was soulful, raw, and captivating. We sat close together in a booth, her hand resting on mine, and for once, the world outside seemed to fade away completely. When the band played a slow number, she pulled me up to dance in the cramped space between tables. I protested at first. I was never much of a dancer. But she laughed and said, "It's not about the steps, Adrian. It's about feeling it." And as we swayed clumsily to the rhythm, her head resting lightly against my shoulder, I realized I didn't care about looking foolish. In that moment, I felt whole. The good times weren't just about fun and adventure. They were also about the sense of partnership I believed we shared. Elena pushed me to dream bigger, And though her methods sometimes stung, I took her words to heart. I started to consider goals I hadn't before, exploring further career advancement, saving for travel, and thinking about what kind of future we could build together. She told me often that she wanted a life filled with meaning, not just routine, and I believed I could help create that with her. We even had long, late-night conversations about what our lives could look like years down the line. She spoke of designing her own space, filled with art and energy, while I talked about the importance of stability and having a home that felt safe. We didn't always align perfectly, but at that point, it felt like those differences only added to our dynamic, creating balance. My friends noticed the change in me. They said I seemed happier, more alive, and in many ways, they were right. I smiled more, worried less, and even my colleagues commented on how I seemed to carry myself with a new kind of confidence. Being with Elena made me feel as though I had tapped into a version of myself I didn't know existed. It was as if her fire had lit something inside me, and for a while it was intoxicating. I thought I had found not just a partner but a muse, someone who could inspire me to become more than I was. There were milestones too, small but significant. The first time she left a toothbrush at my apartment. The first time I bought her favorite snacks without her asking. The first time she referred to us as we when speaking to her friends. Each of those moments felt like stepping stones, leading us towards something serious and lasting. I believed we were building a foundation together, and even when little disagreements surfaced, they were easy to smooth over because the joy between us outweighed everything else. Of course, it's easy to romanticize those times in hindsight, to look back and see only the highlights while ignoring the undertones. But in truth, during those months, I was genuinely happy. Elena could be demanding, yes, but she could also be tender. She knew when to send a message that made my day lighter, when to reach for my hand in a crowded room, when to lean against me in silence and let me know she felt safe. Those gestures, combined with the adventures and laughter, created an image of love that felt strong and unbreakable. If someone had asked me then what I thought of my future with Elena, I would have said without hesitation that I wanted to spend it with her. I would have said that whatever challenges came, we would face them together. I would have said that I was lucky, blessed even, to have found someone who brought so much light into my life. At that point, there was no doubt in my mind that she was the one. The thought that this brightness could fade, that the good times could dissolve into something far darker, never even crossed my mind. For me, those days were the height of everything I thought love could be, and I clung to them as proof that we were meant for each other. The shift didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have recognized it sooner, maybe I would have questioned the direction we were heading. But the first warning signs crept in quietly, disguised as little moments that could be dismissed if I didn't look too closely. That's the thing about relationships that unravel. You rarely see the unraveling until you're tangled in threads you can't escape. With Elena, the first cracks showed themselves in the form of discontent, small but sharp reminders that what I offered was never quite enough. One of the earliest signs came on a Sunday afternoon. We had been out the night before with some of her friends, and I had stayed later than I intended, even though I was exhausted from a long week at work. The next day, I suggested we stay in, maybe cook together or just watch movies. To me, it sounded perfect. Quiet, intimate, restorative. Elena, however, frowned. You don't get it, do you? Sundays are for making memories, not wasting away indoors. She wanted to drive to a nearby town, explore new cafes, and take photos. When I hesitated, she accused me of being boring, of not putting in enough effort to make our time together special. I laughed nervously and went along with it, but I remember feeling an unease settle in my chest. Why wasn't my version of quality time valid? Why did everything have to be on her terms? That question lingered, but I didn't dare voice it. Instead, I convinced myself that relationships required compromise, and that maybe I was just being too rigid. Yet the pattern continued. If I chose the restaurant, she would wrinkle her nose and suggest we go somewhere else. If I planned an evening at home, she would call it uninspired. Even when I tried to surprise her, a picnic I organized one evening after work, she smiled politely, then remarked that the park I chose was too noisy and crowded. I tried to swallow the sting of her words, but little by little, the joy I felt in planning things for us began to dim. Another sign was how quickly my accomplishments seemed to lose their meaning in her eyes. When I received recognition at work for leading a successful campaign, I rushed to tell her, expecting pride or excitement. Instead, she tilted her head and said, "That's nice, Adrian, but don't you think you're capable of more? You shouldn't be satisfied with small wins." She framed it as encouragement, but I couldn't help feeling diminished. What I heard wasn't support. It was disappointment disguised as ambition. Her tone suggested that no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough to meet her expectations. I started to notice how often our conversations revolved around her needs, her goals, her frustrations. I wanted to be a good listener, to be the partner she could lean on, but I realized my voice was fading in the process. If I tried to bring up my struggles, the stress at work, the loneliness I sometimes felt, she would nod absent-mindedly before shifting the topic back to her latest project or complaint. I told myself it was temporary, that maybe she was just going through a busy phase. But deep down, I wondered if she truly saw me as an equal partner, or merely as a backdrop to her own story. There were also moments when she tested the boundaries of respect in subtle ways. At dinners with friends, she would make jokes at my expense, calling me predictable or teasing me for being cautious. Everyone laughed, including me, but inside, I felt small. I noticed the way her eyes flickered around the table, seeking validation from others. And it dawned on me that sometimes her humor wasn't about sharing joy. It was about elevating herself at my cost. It was never outright cruel, but it chipped away at me slowly, like water wearing down stone. The most telling sign, though, was her constant comparison. She had a colleague, a young architect named Daniel, who seemed to embody everything she admired: ambitious, confident, endlessly creative. She often mentioned his achievements, his daring ideas, and his relentless drive. "You should think more like him," she'd say, half joking but not entirely. At first, I ignored it, but the comparisons grew more frequent. Every time she invoked his name, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wanted to believe she was simply inspired by him, but the way she spoke about him made me feel inadequate, like I was competing in a race I never signed up for. Still, I stayed. I told myself these were just bumps in an otherwise beautiful road. Every relationship has its challenges, I thought, and maybe this was just ours. I rationalized her behavior as passion, as high standards born from a drive to live fully. And in truth, there were still tender moments sprinkled in, occasional gestures of affection that made me believe the love was still strong. But those tender moments began to feel less frequent, like fleeting breaks in a storm rather than the steady warmth I once knew. The first warning signs, in hindsight, were not just about what she said or did. They were about how I felt in her presence. I started to notice the heaviness that lingered after our time together, the way my chest tightened instead of relaxing when I thought about seeing her. I began questioning myself more than ever, wondering if I was truly good enough, if I was the problem all along. And perhaps the clearest sign of all was that despite these doubts, I didn't walk away. I clung to the memory of the good times, convincing myself they would return if I just tried harder. That's how it often starts, not with a dramatic betrayal or an obvious fracture, but with whispers of discontent that grow louder the more you ignore them. I didn't realize it then, but those whispers were the first warnings that my love, no matter how steadfast, would never be enough to satisfy Elena's insatiable hunger for more. The little warning signs I brushed aside soon grew into louder alarms, impossible to ignore yet still wrapped in the guise of love and commitment. At first I thought I could manage them, that a deeper conversation or more effort on my part would restore balance. But the truth was, the balance had already tipped. And what followed was a slow descent into a version of our relationship that felt more like endurance than love. What once started as subtle comments and fleeting moments of dissatisfaction began to escalate into recurring arguments, each one leaving deeper cracks in the foundation of what we had built. The first major fight I remember came late on a Wednesday night. I had stayed late at work to finish a project that my team depended on, and by the time I got to Elena's apartment, I was exhausted. I expected at least a smile, maybe a small acknowledgement that I was trying to juggle everything for both of us. Instead, she barely looked up from her phone and muttered, "I waited for hours. Do you even care about this relationship? Or is your job more important than me?" I tried to explain, to reassure her that my work was for our future too, but my words only seemed to inflame her. She accused me of neglect, of failing to prioritize her the way she deserved. The evening ended with her turning her back on me in bed, silent but seething, and me staring at the ceiling, wondering how love had become so conditional. After that, her criticisms grew sharper and more frequent. If I suggested a plan, she found fault in it. If I offered comfort, she dismissed it as insufficient. Even small gestures, picking up her favorite pastry, writing her notes, were met with lukewarm reactions. "It's sweet," she'd say, "but you could have done more." More became her constant refrain, an insatiable demand that no act of mine seemed capable of satisfying. Each attempt to meet her expectations only set the bar higher, leaving me running in circles, exhausted and frustrated. Social gatherings became battlegrounds too. She started pointing out my flaws in front of others, no longer content to keep her discontent private. At a dinner with her friends, when I shared a story about a recent challenge at work, she interrupted with a laugh. "That's Adrian for you. Always making simple things sound complicated." Everyone chuckled politely, but I felt exposed, reduced to a caricature for her amusement. I swallowed my hurt, but it festered. Later that night, when I tried to explain how her words made me feel, she rolled her eyes. "You're too sensitive. Learn to take a joke." That became another recurring theme. My feelings invalidated, brushed aside as weakness. The comparisons to Daniel, her colleague, escalated as well. She began not only praising his accomplishments, but also pointing out how he handled situations better than I did. "Daniel wouldn't hesitate to take risks," she'd remark when I expressed caution about a big decision. "Daniel knows how to live in the moment," she'd say when I suggested a practical plan for the future. It reached a point where his name became a shadow hanging over our conversations, a constant reminder that, in her eyes, I was falling short. I started to dread hearing it, yet it came up more often than I could bear. What hurt most wasn't just her words, but the growing distance between us. The affection that once bound us together, the spontaneous hugs, the gentle touches, the laughter over small things, began to vanish. Intimacy felt mechanical, almost like a duty rather than an expression of love. She often seemed distracted, her eyes glazed as if her thoughts were elsewhere, her mind occupied with worlds I wasn't invited into. When I asked her about it, she claimed she was just tired or stressed, but deep down I knew her heart was drifting. My own behavior started to change too. Where I once entered her presence with ease and excitement, I began approaching cautiously, as though bracing myself for disappointment or criticism. I measured my words carefully, second-guessing whether they would spark another argument. I began staying longer at work, using exhaustion as an excuse, but really avoiding the suffocating air that lingered when we were together. I hated what I was becoming, a version of myself that felt smaller, less vibrant, always striving for approval that never came. One night, after another argument sparked by something as trivial as the way I folded the laundry, I found myself sitting in my car outside her apartment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I asked myself why I was enduring this, why I kept justifying her behavior as passion or high standards. The truth I didn't want to face was that love had been replaced by control, and affection had been replaced by criticism. Yet I still couldn't walk away. I clung to the memory of who she had been in the beginning, convincing myself that if I just endured a little longer, she might return to that version of herself. The escalation reached its peak when she delivered the line that would echo in my mind for weeks. "I deserve better treatment than this." She said it coldly, after berating me for not making a reservation at the new restaurant she wanted to try. It wasn't just disappointment in her voice, it was contempt. In that moment, something inside me cracked too, though I didn't let it show. I smiled weakly, apologized again, and promised to make it up to her. But deep inside, I felt the hollowness of someone who finally recognized the truth. No matter how much I gave, she would never see it as enough. Looking back, the escalation wasn't just about the increase in fights or criticisms. It was about the erosion of hope, the slow realization that what I was fighting to preserve no longer existed. The warmth, the partnership, the laughter, those things had been buried under layers of resentment and impossible demands. And though I wasn't ready to admit it yet, the absence she claimed to fear was the very gift I was beginning to consider giving her. It is strange how breaking points rarely announce themselves with grand gestures or dramatic moments. More often, they slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary evenings, until something small snaps the final thread holding you together. For me, that moment came on a Saturday night. The kind of night I had once looked forward to spending with Elena, but now approached with a sense of dread. We were supposed to attend a gathering hosted by one of her friends, a small house party meant to celebrate a birthday. I had already been stretched thin from a grueling week at work, my body begging for rest, but Elena insisted I go. "You need to show up. she said sharply. "Because people notice when you don't, and frankly, I don't want to explain your absence again." Her words cut more deeply than she realized, because it wasn't about people noticing. It was about her embarrassment of me, about her constant need to display a perfect relationship to the outside world while tearing me down behind closed doors. That evening, I did my best to play the role she demanded. I smiled, shook hands, and even tried to engage in lighthearted conversation, though my energy was on the verge of collapse. At one point, as I quietly refilled her drink in the kitchen, I overheard her speaking to a small group of her friends in the living room. She was laughing, her voice carrying that unmistakable tone she used when she wanted to be admired. "Adrian's sweet," she said, "but sometimes I wonder if he has any ambition at all. He's content with the bare minimum, and honestly, I deserve someone who pushes me, who matches my fire." The room chuckled, some nervously, some with genuine amusement, and my heart sank in my chest. I stood there frozen, holding the glass, realizing I had become a character in her performance, the butt of her jokes, the silent proof of her dissatisfaction. When I walked back into the room and handed her the drink, she smiled at me as though nothing had happened, but something inside me broke in that instant. I looked at her, surrounded by friends who only saw her version of the truth, and I knew I was utterly alone in this relationship. The woman I had fallen for, the one who once lit up my days with her laughter and dreams, was gone. In her place stood someone who no longer respected me, who perhaps never truly had. I went through the motions for the rest of the night, but my spirit had left long before we said our goodbyes and stepped out into the cool air. The silence in the car ride home was unbearable, but I forced myself to break it. "Why did you say that about me?" I asked softly, my voice trembling not with anger but with a kind of wounded disbelief. She glanced at me, her expression hardened. "Oh, come on, Adrian, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke." I shook my head. "No, it wasn't a joke. You meant it." She sighed, exasperated, and muttered, "Well, maybe if you actually showed more ambition, I wouldn't have to say it." That was the final nail in the coffin. There was no apology, no recognition of my feelings, just another attack, another dismissal of who I was. When we got back to her apartment, I didn't go inside. I sat in the car, staring at the dimly lit street, and felt the weight of months of exhaustion press down on me. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully confront the truth I had been avoiding. I was not loved for who I was. I was tolerated, criticized, reshaped, and diminished, but never truly loved. Every effort I had made, every sacrifice, every moment of patience, it had all been consumed by her endless hunger for more, and I had nothing left to give. I realized then that love was not supposed to feel like this, that relationships were not meant to be cages where one person shrinks so the other can stand taller. The days that followed were some of the darkest I had ever experienced. I moved through them mechanically, dragging myself to work, avoiding calls from friends, and coming home to an apartment that felt both suffocating and empty. Elena's words echoed constantly in my head. "I deserve better treatment," as though mocking me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had given her every ounce of myself, and yet it was never enough. The better treatment she claimed to deserve was not something I could ever provide, not because I lacked the will, but because she lacked the capacity to see what I was already offering. One evening I visited my parents for the first time in months. My mother took one look at me and frowned, her eyes scanning the hollowness in my expression. "Adrian," she said gently, "you look so tired. What's going on?" I wanted to brush it off, to protect her from my pain. But the truth poured out of me like water breaking through a dam. I told her about the constant criticism, the comparisons, the public humiliations. I told her how small I felt, how lost. She listened quietly, her eyes glistening, and when I finished, she placed her hand over mine. "Son," she said softly, "love should not make you feel less. Love should build you, not break you. If being with her is destroying you, then maybe the best way to love her, and yourself, is to walk away." Those words were the clarity I had been searching for, the validation I didn't know I needed. I realized then that rock bottom wasn't just about pain. It was about the sudden, undeniable understanding that staying was no longer an option. That night, as I lay in my childhood room, staring at the familiar ceiling I had once dreamed beneath, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not keep sacrificing my spirit for someone who refused to see its worth. I would not keep begging for scraps of affection from someone who thrived on withholding it. I would reclaim my life, even if it meant doing the one thing I feared most, leaving her behind. The morning after I spoke to my mother, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest but also a strange clarity that I had not felt in months. The haze of denial had finally lifted, and what remained was the undeniable truth. Staying with Elena was no longer an act of love, but an act of self-destruction. For too long I had convinced myself that my patience would be rewarded, that her sharp edges would soften, that the warmth I once knew would return. But all of that had been an illusion I clung to out of fear. Now, sitting at the edge of my childhood bed, staring at the framed photos of simpler times, I realized the only way forward was to leave. The decision itself felt terrifying, like stepping into a void, but the greater terror was staying trapped in the cycle I already knew. I drove back to the city with my heart pounding, rehearsing the words in my head. What would I even say to her? How do you end something you once believed would last forever? As I pulled into the familiar street where Elena's apartment sat, I nearly turned around. The thought of seeing her, of enduring her anger or disdain, made my hands shake. But I forced myself to remember the countless nights I lay awake feeling unseen, the sting of her words as she belittled my ambitions, the emptiness that replaced the laughter we once shared. I reminded myself that love without respect is not love at all, and that my silence would only enable her to continue treating me as less. When I walked through her door, Elena was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as though nothing in our world was amiss. She barely glanced at me and muttered, "You're back. Good. We need to talk about where you're taking me for dinner tonight." The entitlement in her tone hit me like a slap, but instead of anger, I felt an overwhelming calm. I sat down across from her and said quietly but firmly, "Elena, we need to talk." She looked up, her brow furrowing at the seriousness in my voice. "What now, Adrian?" she asked, already exasperated, as though bracing for another conversation she intended to win. For the first time in months, I didn't shrink under her gaze. "I can't do this anymore," I said. The words felt heavy but liberating, as though they had been waiting at the tip of my tongue for far too long. She blinked, confused, then laughed coldly. "Can't do what? Put in a little effort? Be a real partner?" I shook my head, my voice steady. "No, I can't keep giving everything and being told it's not enough. I can't keep shrinking myself to fit into your expectations. I've tried, Elena. I've tried harder than I should have, but it's never been enough for you. And I realize now that it never will be." Her laughter died, replaced by anger that flashed in her eyes. "So what, you're leaving me? After everything I've put into this relationship, you're just gonna walk away?" I almost laughed at the irony, her claiming she had put in everything, when in truth it had been me carrying the weight all along. But I didn't argue. Instead, I simply nodded. "Yes, I'm leaving, because the best treatment I can give you is my absence. You wanted more than I could give, and maybe you'll find it elsewhere. But I won't stay here, bleeding myself dry, trying to prove my worth to someone who refuses to see it." She stared at me in stunned silence, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for a retort. Finally, she spat out, "You'll regret this. You'll never find someone who puts up with you the way I have." I felt a flicker of pain at her words, but it quickly dissolved into relief. Because in that moment, I knew I would rather face loneliness than stay bound to a love that made me feel invisible. I stood up, walked into the bedroom, and began packing the few belongings I had left there. Each item I folded into my bag felt like another piece of myself I was reclaiming. My hands trembled, but my resolve did not. Elena followed me, alternating between insults and pleas. "You're weak, you're pathetic, you're throwing away something real," she snapped, then moments later softened her tone, saying, "Wait, don't do this, we can fix it, I'll change." Her desperation might have swayed me months earlier, but now it only confirmed the cycle I needed to escape. I zipped up the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and looked at her one last time. "Goodbye, Elena," I said, my voice firm. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker there. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control. Walking out of that apartment felt like dragging myself through mud, each step heavier than the last. But the moment I stepped outside and the crisp air hit my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. My chest loosened, my breath came easier, and though the pain was still there, it was the kind of pain that promised healing, not destruction. I didn't look back. Not once. Over the next few days, the reality of my decision settled in. Elena sent message after message, ranging from venomous accusations to desperate apologies. At first, I read them, my heart twisting with each word, but soon I stopped opening them altogether. Because every time I considered responding, I remembered my mother's voice, the exhaustion etched into my own reflection, and the truth that leaving had already given me more peace than staying ever had. Slowly, I began to reclaim my life, cooking simple meals in my quiet apartment, reconnecting with friends I had distanced myself from, even taking long walks without worrying about who I had to answer to. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't living under the shadow of someone else's expectations. The absence I gave her was not just an ending, it was the beginning of finding myself again. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I finally trusted that it was better to walk it alone than to lose myself trying to keep someone else satisfied. The weeks that followed my departure from Elena's life were not filled with fireworks of triumph or sudden bursts of joy. They were quiet, deliberate, and at times unbearably lonely. Yet within that stillness, I found something far more valuable than the fleeting highs of our relationship. I found myself again. For the first time in months, my mornings no longer began with anxiety over whether my efforts would be criticized, whether my gestures would be dismissed, or whether my words would be twisted. I woke up in silence, made coffee in my small kitchen, and let the calm seep into the corners of my life. At first, the absence of her voice felt deafening, but soon, it became a balm, a reminder that peace was possible when chaos no longer lived under your roof. One of the most surprising changes was how I began to notice the little things again. The sound of rain tapping against my window, the way the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange, the warmth of a friend's laughter when I finally reconnected with them. It struck me how much I had missed while consumed by Elena's constant demands. Life had kept moving, offering me small joys and quiet beauties, but I had been too busy trying to prove my worth to someone who refused to see it. Now those overlooked details felt like gifts, reminders that the world was still capable of wonder if I only allowed myself to see it. There were difficult moments too. Nights when I lay awake wondering if I had done the right thing, if I had been too quick to give up, or if I would regret my choice when loneliness pressed in too tightly. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of that night at the party, of the cold laughter as Elena belittled me in front of others, of the emptiness I had felt in her presence. Those memories were not anchors anymore. They were compass points, guiding me away from what I had endured and towards something better. Gradually, I began investing in myself again. I picked up sketching, something I had loved as a teenager but abandoned when life got too busy. I found joy in the simple act of pencil against paper, in creating something purely for myself with no judgment waiting on the other end. I started jogging in the mornings, not because anyone expected me to, but because it cleared my mind and reminded me of the strength my body still carried. I visited my parents more often, savoring the comfort of their home-cooked meals and the gentle wisdom in their words. Slowly, I realized that the life I had thought Elena was supposed to complete was already whole within me. I had just lost sight of it. Friends who had drifted away during my relationship began reappearing too. Some admitted they had noticed how I had changed while with her, how withdrawn I had become, but they hadn't known how to reach me. Their honesty stung, but it also reassured me that I was not invisible after all. Over dinners and long conversations, I rediscovered the warmth of companionship that required no performance, no constant proving, just authenticity. With every laugh shared, every story told, I felt the pieces of myself knitting back together. Perhaps the most powerful shift came in how I viewed love itself. For so long, I had equated love with sacrifice, believing that giving endlessly, even at the cost of my own spirit, was proof of devotion. But now I understood that love without respect is hollow, and love without kindness is cruelty in disguise. True love is not about enduring pain to keep someone else comfortable. It is about mutual growth, about building one another up, about feeling safe in each other's presence. The treatment I had longed for from Elena was not something extravagant or unattainable. It was as simple as being seen, heard, and valued. I realized, too, that her demand, "I deserve better treatment," was not wrong in itself. Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect. But where she had faltered was in failing to see that I had already given those things freely. She mistook my patience for weakness, my consistency for insufficiency, and my love for obligation. In truth, what she craved was not better treatment but endless validation, and no amount of giving could have filled that void. By leaving, I finally gave her the one thing she could never demand, my absence. And in that absence, I gave myself back the dignity I had surrendered. Months later, I saw her once in passing. She was walking down the street with someone I didn't recognize, her arm looped through his, her laughter echoing in the evening air. For a brief moment, a pang of memory tugged at me, the way she used to laugh with me, the early days when everything seemed possible. But then, as I continued walking, I felt only relief. Whatever performance she was putting on for him was no longer my concern. I had stepped out of that theater, out of that role, and into a life where I no longer had to audition for worthiness. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I understand that leaving wasn't just an act of ending, it was an act of beginning. My absence was not a punishment but a gift, both to her and to myself. To her, it was the mirror she needed to face her own patterns without my presence to shield her from the consequences. To me, it was the doorway back to self-respect, to joy, to the quiet beauty of a life lived authentically. If there is one truth I carry forward from all of this, it is that sometimes the best way to treat someone is not to stay and keep giving until you have nothing left. Sometimes, the kindest act is to walk away and let them find what they think they deserve elsewhere, while you reclaim the peace you always deserved yourself. Love is not measured by how much pain you can endure for another person. It is measured by how much life you can share without losing yourself in the process. And if there is any wisdom I can pass on, it is this: do not be afraid to choose yourself. Because when you do, you create space for the kind of love, be it from others or within yourself, that truly honors who you are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.